I live in a quiet, unassuming suburb just outside a mid-sized city. It's the kind of place where the streets roll up by 9, where chain restaurants and gas stations hum under buzzing fluorescent lights. Nothing much happens here, and that's why what I'm about to tell you doesn't make sense. At least, not entirely. It was late November, cold enough that my breath frosted the car window as I sat in the parking lot of our local McDonald's. This was my usual late-night ritual, a quick trip for fries and a Coke after a long shift at the warehouse. Comfort food, you know? The golden arches stood tall and glowing against the night sky, a beacon of familiarity. But that night, something felt off. The lot was nearly empty, except for a single car parked 2 spaces over, a beat-up sedan with fogged-up windows. I glanced inside as I got out of my car, but couldn't make out much. The driver's seat looked occupied, though. I could just make out the faint outline of a head against the headrest. The automatic doors whooshed open as I stepped inside. The warm, greasy air hit me, and the harsh fluorescence lit up the otherwise dim interior. The place was dead. Just me, a teenage cashier, slouched over the counter scrolling through her phone, and an older man in a booth near the back, slowly sipping coffee. I stepped up to order. "Hi, large fries and a Coke, please," I said. The girl nodded without looking up. Her name tag read Sandy. She tapped on the register with the mechanical rhythm of someone who'd done this a million times. Behind her, the kitchen was eerily quiet. No sizzle of fryers, no chatter from the staff. Just silence. She handed me my receipt and mumbled, "It'll be a minute." I stepped aside to wait, trying not to focus on the uneasy silence. That's when I noticed the man in the booth. He wasn't sipping his coffee anymore. He was staring at me. No, not at me. Through me. Like I wasn't even there. I tried to ignore him, glancing at my phone, scrolling through social media. But every few seconds I'd look up, and he'd still be staring. His face was pale, gaunt. His eyes looked wet, like he'd been crying, or worse. I was relieved when Sandy finally slid my bag of food across the counter. "Have a good night," she mumbled. As I turned to leave, the man stood up. He was tall, taller than he looked sitting down, and his movements were stiff, almost jerky. He walked toward the door at the same time I did, his eyes never leaving me. I clutched the bag tighter, quickening my pace. I pushed through the doors into the cold night air and headed straight for my car. The lot was emptier now. Even the fogged-up sedan was gone. My stomach tightened as I slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors. The man had stepped outside too, but he wasn't walking toward a car. He just stood there, under the glow of the McDonald's sign, watching me. His mouth moved like he was whispering something, but I couldn't hear him through the glass. I jammed the key into the ignition and started the car. As I pulled out of the lot, I glanced in my rearview mirror. He was still there, his face illuminated in the red glow of my taillights, still staring. I should have gone straight home, but I didn't. I couldn't shake the image of his face, the strange silence inside the restaurant, the missing sedan. Instead, I parked a few blocks away, under a street lamp, and opened the bag to distract myself. The fries were there, golden and steaming. But the Coke? It wasn't Coke. The cup felt heavier than usual, the lid slightly bulging. I peeled it off, and the smell hit me first, metallic and rancid. Inside was a thick, dark liquid, almost black in the dim light. Blood. I gagged, nearly dropping the cup, but I froze when I saw something floating in it, a small, wrinkled object pale against the dark liquid. My hands shook as I fished it out with a napkin. It was a finger. A human finger. Severed at the second joint. The nail blackened. My heart pounded as I hurled the cup out the window, spilling its contents onto the pavement. My first thought was to call the police, but my phone was dead. I hadn't charged it since my shift ended. My only option was to drive back to the McDonald's and demand answers. When I pulled into the lot again, the place looked different. The lights inside were off. The golden arches dimmed. My gut told me to leave, but I was too shaken, too angry. I needed to know what the hell was going on. I banged on the glass doors. "Hello? Sandy? Anyone?" No answer. I peered inside. The dining area was empty, but something caught my eye. Movement in the kitchen. A shadow flitted past, quick and deliberate. I banged again, harder. The door creaked open. Not all the way, just a crack. "Hello," I called, stepping inside. The smell hit me first. Grease, yes, but also something else. Something faintly chemical, like bleach. The floor glistened, wet and shiny under the faint glow of an emergency exit light. I moved cautiously toward the counter, calling out again. As I leaned over to see behind the counter, I spotted a mop bucket, its water swirling red. A smear of something dark led into the kitchen, disappearing through the swinging doors. My stomach dropped. "Sandy?" My voice shook. I stepped closer, my shoes squeaking against the wet tile. The kitchen was a mess, battered trays, toppled boxes of frozen patties. And then I saw her, Sandy, slumped against the walk-in freezer, her phone still clutched in one hand. Her uniform was soaked, the fabric around her stomach dark and sticky. Her eyes fluttered open, and she tried to speak, but her voice came out a hoarse whisper. "Run." Before I could process her warning, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate. They came from the far side of the kitchen where the man from the booth now stood, framed by the light of the open freezer. He wasn't holding a knife anymore. He didn't need to. His face stretched into a grin, impossibly wide, his teeth jagged and yellow in the dim light. I bolted, slipping and stumbling my way out of the restaurant. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, tearing out of the lot, tires screeching. I reported the McDonald's to the police the next day, but when they investigated, they found nothing. No Sandy, no blood, no mess. Just a clean, empty restaurant, closed for renovations. But I know what I saw. I know what I tasted every time I thought about those fries. And every so often, late at night, I drive past the McDonald's. It's always lit up, always open, but I've never gone back inside, because I know that once you do, you might not come back out. I live in a small town nestled between two major highways. It's one of those places you'd miss if you blinked while driving through, but it has its charm. We've got a diner, a gas station, and a McDonald's, the latter being where everyone goes after dark. It's the only place that stays open 24/7, and it's always packed with teenagers, truckers, and late-night stragglers. I used to work the night shift there, flipping burgers and cleaning fryers, usually alone with only a manager in the back office. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid for my college textbooks. Besides, nothing bad ever happened in a town like ours, or so I thought. It started on a Wednesday, sometime around midnight. I remember the time because the usual rush from the local factory had just cleared out, and the dining area was eerily empty. The hum of the fluorescent lights buzzed louder than usual, or maybe I just noticed it more without the chatter of customers. The air felt heavier, too, like a storm was brewing, even though the weather forecast had called for clear skies. I was wiping down the counter when I saw the first sign something was off. There was a man standing in the parking lot, facing the building. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring. His figure was barely lit by the golden glow of the McDonald's arches, but I could make out his shape. A tall man, thin, almost too thin, with something slung over his shoulder. "Hey, do you see that guy?" I called to my manager, Lisa, who was perched in the back office scrolling through her phone. She barely looked up. "Probably some drunk," she said, uninterested. I shrugged it off and went back to wiping down the counter, but when I glanced out the window again, he was gone. The parking lot was empty except for a few cars from earlier. I figured he must have wandered off. This was McDonald's, not some horror movie. People loitered all the time. But then the sound started, a soft scraping, like nails dragging across concrete. It came from the drive-through lane, long and slow. "Lisa, there's something outside," I said, my voice a little tighter now. She sighed, clearly annoyed, and finally got up to check. She flicked through the security camera feeds, her eyes narrowing. "There's nothing there," she said. "It's just your imagination. Go clean the fryer." I wanted to believe her, but the unease in my chest only grew. As I walked to the back, I glanced over my shoulder and swore I saw movement in the corner of my eye. Something low to the ground, darting past the window. The fryer room felt safe, insulated by the constant hiss of bubbling oil and the familiar smell of grease. But even that comfort was short-lived. The lights flickered once, then twice, before plunging into complete darkness. "Lisa!" I called out, but the word felt swallowed by the silence. I reached for my phone to use as a flashlight, but before I could turn it on, the emergency lights kicked in, bathing the kitchen in a dim, unnatural red glow. It made everything look wrong: elongated shadows, twisted reflections in the fryer grease. That's when I heard the knock. It wasn't coming from the front door or the windows. It came from the freezer. I stared at the heavy metal door, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The knock came again, louder this time. 3 sharp, deliberate taps. "Lisa!" I called again, my voice cracking. No response. I crept toward the freezer, each step feeling like a mistake. My hand shook as I grabbed the handle and pulled it open. The cold air rushed out, freezing my breath mid-air. The freezer was empty, nothing but boxes of frozen fries and patties. But the knocking continued, louder now, echoing from somewhere deeper. Then I saw it. At the far end of the freezer, behind a stack of boxes, was a hole. A dark, gaping hole that definitely wasn't there before. It wasn't part of the building plans. I'd seen them during training. The walls were supposed to be solid, impenetrable. The knocking stopped. A whisper took its place, faint and raspy, like someone speaking from the other side of a cracked door. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was pleading, desperate. I bolted, slamming the freezer shut behind me. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stumbled back into the kitchen. The emergency lights flickered again, and for a brief moment, I saw a shadow move across the dining area, a tall figure with something slung over its shoulder. "Lisa!" I screamed. But she wasn't in the office. Her phone lay abandoned on the desk. The screen shattered as if she'd dropped it in a hurry. I ran to the front door, but it wouldn't budge. The automatic lock system must have shorted with the power. I banged on the glass, screaming for help, but the streets were empty. Even the usual hum of passing cars on the highway was gone. Then I heard it, the sound of heavy breathing, coming from the kitchen. I turned slowly, my pulse hammering in my throat. The figure stood there, just at the edge of the emergency light's reach. He was taller than I'd thought, his head almost brushing the ceiling. In his hands, he held a burlap sack, stained dark at the bottom. "Who are you?" I demanded, though my voice barely rose above a whisper. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into the sack and pulled out something small and pale, a doll's head, its plastic face cracked and hollow. He placed it on the counter and tilted his head, as if waiting for a reaction. I didn't wait to find out what he wanted. I grabbed the nearest thing, a metal tray, and hurled it at him before darting toward the back exit. The door flew open, and I sprinted into the night, my lungs burning with every step. When I finally stopped, I was halfway down the highway, my hands scraped and bloodied from falling. I turned back to look at the McDonald's. It stood there, silent and dark, the golden arches flickering faintly. Lisa was never found. The police said she must have walked off the job, but I know better. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the knocking in my dreams. 3 sharp, deliberate taps, always followed by that whisper. I haven't stepped foot in a McDonald's since,